Welcome to the Friday edition of Juan's World. And I'm going to pick up where I left off last time, talking about reasonableness in the context of the frameworks we build in order to make sense of our world by building social constructs. So I'd advise you to go back and look at my thoughts on social constructs to make a little bit more sense of this. This one's going to be kind of convoluted, probably a bit circular. And before I start, I'm just going to salvage my cooking bona fides by showing you some images of some things I've been doing. As I said last time, I've had a terrible tendency to just make cottage pie and fruit crumble for weeks on end, a really bad habit. And I decided yesterday, just on a whim, to do something that is quite common in Korea and also in other parts of Asia, including Cambodia, which is to grill meat, sometimes adding some sauces, but oftentimes not, just grilling over charcoal, which I don't have, but I do have a dry pan which I kind of grilled some pork in. And then you wrap the pork in some kind of green leaf, like a lettuce leaf or sometimes spicy greens, wrapped with, in Korean case, kimchi, and also usually rice, and then wrap it up in the green leaf and pop it in your mouth. And I just found that so tasty that I ended up making, I don't know, 20 of them yesterday, just eating one after the other. Unfortunately, I didn't have very good leaves to wrap the pork and kimchi in, because I bought some packaged salad at the market and I didn't realize that the leaves are pretty small, but it doesn't really matter. You just wrap them up and eat them. I did have to do it at the stove and over the sink because it's really messy, but it was just wonderful. And I think I will do a formal video on this mode of preparing meat next time. But for right now, let's talk about what it means to be reasonable. So to just recap very briefly, what I was saying was that our social constructs concerning things like truth, beauty, security, and so forth are built within a framework or on a foundation, whatever metaphor you want. And that foundation or that framework has to be reasonable. And here's where we get caught into circularity, because what is reasonable is also socially determined. You could say that reasonableness is itself a social construct. That's where it gets to be a real dilemma. What we have to do in the end, and I've mentioned this before, is that we have to start with some foundational assumptions, things that we cannot prove, but that when we apply them, our conclusions drawn from those assumptions work. And in the end, in a Western scientific sense, the proof of everything is in its ability to work for us. In the case of science, working for us means being able to make accurate predictions. Now, here's a very simple test. There are some people who think the Earth is flat. They're following a rather narrow view of the book of Genesis, the first chapter in particular, and they're also using their own senses in a limited way. And they're saying, well, when I look at the horizon, it looks flat. I can't feel the Earth moving in any way. My limited perception suggests that the Earth is flat and that the sun, the moon, and the stars all rotate around the Earth. And of course, this was reasonable for a very long time because of those very reasons. But various scientists came along and said, well, okay, if you start with those empirical observations, then you have a certain satisfying worldview, but certain things just don't make sense. One of them being why certain stars appear to move against the background of other stars. So come up with a theory of wandering stars. Well, why do they wander? How do they wander? What keeps them up there? And one of the more important questions was, why do they move in a funny way? Like all the other celestial bodies appear to move in a straight, like circular pattern, like the sun goes up and comes down, the moon goes around, and the stars all go around. And then there's these weird wandering stars that go around, and then they stop, and they go back for a bit, and then they go on, and they go back for a bit, and then they go on. And that's all a bit puzzling. You can't really figure out, like, why are they doing that? And people like Ptolemy devised this idea that they were actually going in these kind of epicycles, that they were going round, but they were looping back and round and looping back and so forth. And so when seen from the perspective of the Earth, they appear to be going forward and back, and then forward and then back and then forward, because they were really going loop-de-loop-de-loop-de-loop. Now, here we can start asking, is it reasonable that these wandering stars or planets should be moving in that way? And some people, okay, yeah, seems reasonable. And a few people said, no, I don't think it's all that reasonable. Maybe we can come up with another explanation that will not only be simpler, but will also allow us to draw correct conclusions about the future, about predictions. And one of the things that we can do now, for example, with great accuracy, is we can predict where and when every solar and lunar eclipse will be. We can do that because we have a very good model of the motion of the planets around the sun within the solar system. And we have documented with very great accuracy, and again, when I use the word we here, I mean people, not me, but people that I respect, that it's astounding to me, in fact, how accurate these predictions can be. There was an annular solar eclipse that was seen, apart from anywhere else, over China on the 21st of June, predicted with very great accuracy how long it was going to last. The fact that it was going to be annular, that is, the moon was not going to completely block the sun, but was going to leave a little ring. Annulus is the Latin for ring. It's going to leave a little ring of sun around the moon. And this has been predicted for decades. So, if you want to be a flat earther, and if you want to believe that the Earth is the center of the solar system, then one of my challenges is predict the next solar eclipse using your model. That would be a test of reasonableness. Right? That reasonableness comes from the root, of course, of reason. So now we get down to the really sticky point, which is, what is reason? Now, reason can be a noun. Say, I have my reasons. Or it can be a verb, to reason, which means to develop a logical line of attack on something. And the two are obviously related. Like that, to have reasons means that you have reasoned something through. But what counts as a reason, and proper methods of reasoning, gets into deep water. Methods of reasoning is another way of talking about Western systems of logic. And these go back mostly to Aristotle's concept of logic, although it's been considerably advanced and made more sophisticated, particularly in the late 19th and early 20th century onwards, by people like Bertrand Russell, who combined logic and mathematics. And so we have what we could call mathematical reasoning. Now, this is the thing about mathematics, about reason, about any system in any culture. There are underlying every system of reason and logic and mathematics assumptions. Assumptions that cannot be proven. We have to take them as reasonable. Like, for example, I'd mentioned this before, Euclid's fifth postulate that parallel lines drawn, well, no matter how far they're drawn on a plane surface, will never meet. Not even in infinity. That's reasonable, because when we draw parallel lines with a pencil and a ruler, compasses, what have you, they don't meet. So you can imagine them being extended indefinitely and still not meeting. But it's an assumption. There's another assumption that I'm always fond of articulating, that is that modern science is based on the reasonable assumption that if you keep all of the variables under control and you do something, we call that a cause. If you do something and the variables are always kept constant, the effect will always be the same. And that's the fundamental assumption of all Western science. That if you put zinc in hydrochloric acid, every time you do it, you'll get zinc chloride and hydrogen gas given off. And if you don't get hydrogen gas given off, then one of the variables has been corrupted, or there is a variable in there that you haven't taken into account, but that the same cause will also produce the same effect. Always. Now this is one of the differences between modern chemistry and alchemy. The alchemists believed that if you did the same thing enough times, one time it would be possible for there to be a different result. So they were working on a different assumption. And we can now say, I don't think the alchemist's assumption is reasonable, because every time I do a certain thing expecting a certain outcome, if I don't get that outcome, then I assume that it's because I have changed one of the variables inadvertently. Not that the rules of the universe have changed. The assumption is that the rules of the universe always stay the same. Well, how do we know that? We don't. The only way that you can test that empirically is to live for an infinite amount of time and do an infinite amount of experiments and always have the same result. Well, we don't have that time, so we have to make that assumption. And the reason that that assumption is reasonable is because it works. But there might be times when it doesn't, and we don't notice. That's, to me, the really exciting prospect in some ways. Like, let's take a very good baker. He bakes bread every day, 100 loaves every day. And he does this for 30 years. Very famous baker. Everything is wonderful. His bread sells out instantly. He opens his doors, and every day he does the baking in the same way. Same amount of flour, water, sugar, yeast, whatever. The dough rises. Everything is the same. Baking temperatures, everything's the same. And then one day, 30 years later, he pops all the bread in the oven, opens it up when they should be done, and they're horrible. They're flat, they haven't risen at all, they're tasteless. Now, what's the reasonable conclusion? The reasonable conclusion is he did something different and he didn't notice. But he either he did something different or there was some variable that was different. Maybe something about the air quality or humidity, or maybe his oven didn't work, or that's the reasonable assumption. But we cannot rule out the possibility that one time the rules of the universe are changed. We can't rule it out. It's not a particularly reasonable conclusion to draw, but we cannot rule it out. In fact, we can't rule out anything being different, hopelessly occasionally, like once in a quadrillion times, things are different. We can't ever rule that out. So here's where I'm going to take what you might consider a slightly left turn in this line of reasoning. What I'm obviously suggesting at the outset is that we have faith in our scientific principles of mathematics and so forth, because they work for us. They allow us to do things we want to do. They allow us to build fast cars, aeroplanes, but they also allow us to build machine guns, atomic bombs, and so forth. So there is a moral issue that creeps in here to the concept of reasonableness. Is it reasonable to build atomic bombs, machine guns, mortars, and so forth? Is it reasonable to go to war with other people? And this is where certain religious principles come in. And I'll just mention my particular interpretation of Christianity at this point, but I could just as easily use Hinduism or Buddhism or Judaism or Islam or any number of other religious principles. The question that these religions are asking at a deep level is not really so much the meaning of life. I remember I did a video on the meaning of life, the purpose of living, and so forth. They're asking, what is a good life? And here, all these principles of reasonableness that I've been talking about stop working. I believe, for example, without complete evidence, but using the Greek Bible as my basis, I believe that Jesus was going around Galilee and Judah saying that the way to have a good life is to be loving. And that's it. That's the beginning and end of his message. And it's been corrupted and perverted in all kinds of different ways by the gospel writers themselves, and then by subsequent theologians and churchmen and so forth. But Jesus was saying, if you love everybody, and by extension, if everybody loves everybody else, we will have the kingdom of heaven on earth. And the extraordinary thing about that claim is it's never been tested, scientifically or otherwise. And that is an area that I want to pursue more next time I talk about these things. I'm I'm going to do some cooking on Tuesday. But when I come back next Friday, I'm going to continue my thoughts about reasonableness, about social constructs and all the rest of it. But I'm going to talk about fundamentals. And the fundamentals that I'm going to start with are the fundamentals that drive Christianity, in my opinion. That is the way I see Christianity, which is not particularly common or popular, but which I believe lies at the heart of the message of Jesus. And I want to then extrapolate from that and suggest that something along those lines lies at the heart of most world religions, which have also been perverted and corrupted by dogma and theologians over the years. But what I'm suspecting, no proof, no evidence, is that there is a universal consciousness which scientists are just beginning to glimmer, and that somehow, once in a very, very great while, a person is able to tap into that consciousness more directly than most other people. I'll explore why they can and we can't, or all kinds of other questions. For now, I'll ask you to like and subscribe, maybe ponder what I'm rambling about here in a circular fashion, and I will do some cooking for you on Tuesday and then return to this subject on Friday.